All right. So for the participants who are joining us on Zoom here for the Q&A, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom if you have a question. And also feel free to upvote your favorite questions, and we'll make sure to get to them. If we don't get to them, we'll copy and paste them to Slack, the channel dedicated to this keynote, and then hopefully Clint will be gracious to answer your questions. Thank you so much, Clint, for this great taxonomy of split bodies in the context of COVID-19. So I want to start us off with a question, um, and then hopefully that will give the participants some time. So as I was listening, of course, does the coronavirus have an unconscious? I was thinking about the two bodies of the coronavirus, the actual body, or let's say ego of the coronavirus, which physically infects people, and we have in the US something like 100,000 deaths so far. And then
In the US, yeah.
there's the virtual body of the coronavirus, or the unconscious of the coronavirus, which is affecting us all through the internet, whether we're physically infected or not. So there's this virtual infection, if you will, and there's a kind of uh, uh, actual infection. So both kinds of infections. So, and also you talked about the two classes of workers, the essential workers that do not have the privilege to work from home, and then of course those working from home. So of course this sets up a whole new ideology, if you will, a whole new class configuration in this context. And so my question was uh, about the phenomenon of denial that we see among conservatives who argue for quote unquote opening the economy, which of course was never closed, and against the state mandated lockdown, which they find, authoritarian or oppressive, and how do you make sense of that in relation to the two bodies of the coronavirus? Like, how do they position themselves vis-a-vis that? Because clearly they're absolutely in denial. So I don't know if you thought about that.
Well, I think one of the interesting sort of ideological or political effects of the coronavirus is to remind us that we actually do have bodies, that work is carried out by workers with bodies, whether they're the privileged workers like myself, who I teach from home as a university professor, but nonetheless, I'm still in my house. I still have people around me, and so on and so forth, versus the so-called frontline workers, and of course, even all the accolades that we garner towards healthcare workers and frontline workers and food delivery persons in my city in Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. People bang pots at 7 p.m. every evening and clap and so on. And so that's a kind of a honorific, and frontline workers is a kind of an honorific. But nonetheless, those people's bodies are themselves at risk. People working in hospitals, and friends of mine who work in hospitals talk about even where in the PPE itself becomes, when you wear a mask for 8 hours in a day, and you're supposed to sort of change them, but there isn't enough stuff around, and so people have to sort of keep using the same ones, or they sterilize them now with microwaves, all kinds of hacks going on. So that is to say that this pandemic, this plague, the coronavirus, is reminding us of our bodies themselves. But even our body, then, in a psychoanalytic sense, turns out to be something that we have certain kind of phantasmic notions of, and so on. And I think this is what disturbs some of we used to have climate change deniers. Now we have coronavirus deniers, because they don't want to be reminded of that they have bodies. So there's an ideological thing going on there, and also that the bodies of the people who are both producing, delivering their food or taking care of their loved ones, and workers that I also discussed, which is to say the unemployables, the people in whether in prisons or in detention centers, the ICE concentration camps in the U.S. under freeways and so on in Texas, or on indigenous reserves, or in the favelas and the slums and so on. Those whose bodies have been deemed not to be socially necessary labor, and then are susceptible, as you know, from people who've been deported and so on, who are even more susceptible to the coronavirus. So I think that it's the unconscious of the coronavirus is reminding us of the very material conditions of our body, which are also phantasmic at the same time. And I think these are challenges then to conservative ideologues.
Thank you. Yeah, so it seems like those working from home today are like the new bourgeoisie, if you will. And what you just described, this denial is kind of also false consciousness, if you will, right? So here's a question
Yeah, can I?
from.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
saw.
Hello?
Saw it.
You got caught a little bit, so if you can start from the beginning, thank you.
Sorry about that. So this is from Alfonso Williams in Cleveland, and he's asking, how can we use the unconscious effects of the coronavirus to bridge everyday daily as constituents and government managers? How can both sides make the ethical faults that we're seeing better? How do we address the ethical dilemmas that arise that the coronavirus brings to our attention? It brings to our attention the, certainly, I mean, in Canada, we feel smug because we have a social democracy and we have public health care. But nonetheless, certainly in many parts of the world, access to healthcare itself is a political as well as an ethical struggle and dilemma. And how is going in this direction, sort of notion that policymakers and so on are suddenly going to wake up and be aware that they need to be more accountable to their constituents under the conditions of parliamentary democracy is a question of on.
So we're having trouble a little bit with the internet connection. You're seeing the questions come in. So there's a big one from Alberto here that you can take a stab at if you want.
Yeah. So Alberto is connecting up the notions of the two bodies of the university to Agamben's latest op-ed. Am I coming through okay, Robert?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. This is to do with Agamben, who said that teachers who agree to teach online now are the same as university professors who pledged allegiance to fascism in 1931. God. Okay, the question, can you say a little bit more about the not al universitas I discussed at the end? Kind of isolate collectivity. Wow. Is the body of nature one that can be articulated in the psychoanalytic register? I mean, I think there are I want to cut and paste that, and I think there are possibilities for that there are possibilities for a collectivity via the online. As in the past, it was pamphleteering or mural art or graffiti or the publication of chapbooks and other uses of media and different sorts of material culture. I don't want to overestimate it, but I also don't want to throw it under the bus as a totally to be disparaged kind of form of collectivity. And in terms of isolate collectivity, that certainly is the problem, I think, with online discussions in general or internet. And we're sort of caught up in this sort of one-to-one sort of connection with each other. But I think there's also a utopian possibility and maybe even to adopt Alberto's terms from his talk, his great talk on Friday, a kind of a dual biopower or a duo internet power of use the very purposes that it's being designed for and commodified for. Maybe I'll turn to the next question. Is that okay?
Yeah. So the next one is from Coney.
Oh, from Connie? Okay.
Yeah. And so this was an amazing talk, adding to your two-body distinction and to Robert's initial question. We can say we are witnessing a dual ideology at play, that of people's not knowing what they are doing, and that which Zizek calls the cynical subject of knowing very well what they're doing, but nonetheless still doing it. As Zizek reminds us, cynicism is the answer of the ruling culture, but then the COVID-19 has changed us profoundly, and at this point we cannot go back to a normal. Like Alfonso points out, this is an ethical dilemma we see at play, and I wonder, how do we proceed from here?
Yeah, a great question about the role of cynicism. And of course, cynicism is always caught up in the kind of the mechanism that Zizek also talks about, a fetishist disavowal. So, which is to say that I know very well, but so I know I know very well that healthcare is not being apportioned in an equal fashion. I know very well that the people who are suffering from and dying from COVID-19 overwhelmingly and disproportionately affects Black and brown bodies, not only because of pre-existing conditions and lack of access to healthcare, but because those are the bodies that are working in the hospitals, that in Canada are working in the long-term care facilities, and that are more susceptible to these conditions and to the coronavirus. And this is where, I mean, I want to take, I sort of ended up, and it might have seemed too utopian to some of my hard-nosed critics, to close by talking about the "we are all in this together" sort of mantra, and I think there is a, that not all universitas that Alberto is asking me about, or what philosophers like Badiou and Zizek talk about in terms of this kind of moment of an event or moment of universality that is possible. I mean, there is a kind of a weird planetary collective consciousness that's happening right now, and we can despair. I don't want to disparage it, and I do want to have a feeling that we are feeling connected with people in South Korea, or in China, or in Italy, or in New York City, in ways that were a bit more difficult beforehand. And so there are some possibilities, some structures of feeling, to use Raymond Williams' term, I think that can come out of these kind of conditions without giving up on the struggle.
So one of the things you talked about is the split screen in relation to split subjectivity. And I don't know if you got a chance to see here Babette Babish's keynote, but she had this critique of screen being, this kind of being that is not even noticing the smudges on the screen because they're completely basically isolated from themselves. So, which is in a way similar to the denial that I asked about earlier, this kind of denial of our own mortality. And in a way, it's a kind of a humanistic point. So maybe if you can think about exploring this material and immaterial dimensions of the university, but also thinking of alternatives to this the monopoly of Zoom and alternatives to screen being. How can we be in solidarity and connect globally, but in more subversive ways?
Yeah, that's a great question, Robert. Thanks. I mean, I think that the screen and the smudge on the screen and what I was talking, those are great figures or metaphors. And also when I was talking about the split screen, when we can think about, Freud talks about the screen memory, and he means a memory that is actually blocking off what happened to us, is screening us from it. But now we think of a screen as something that shows us something, that shows us an image. And there's indeed in media studies, there's a whole genre called screen studies, meaning both television and film, but also video. And can we have a collectivity or a possibility of collectivity via the screen? I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's another form of communication. It's another medium of communication. There are always possibilities for organizing and for collective thought via these forms of communication. But social distancing can also lead to a kind of neoliberal individualism. So that's why, that great meme that's going around that Alberto referred to on Friday of from the US of social distancing equals communism. Yes and no. Social distancing means your selfishness is also protecting others because you're not getting too close to them, but it can also result in everyone being behind their screens.
There's a question here from Rawia. Is COVID-19 an occupier / settler?
Yes, thanks, Roya. The history of certainly in terms of the Jared Diamond thesis of guns and germs, the history of the spread of smallpox and cholera and other diseases via and with colonialism, if not actually the smallpox infected blankets, which is somewhat of an urban myth, but certainly in terms of just the arrival of those diseases on populations and peoples who weren't prepared for them in the past, suggests that coronavirus is just the newest sort of form of these kinds of infestations. And I mean, the other side of that, of course, is that the coronavirus has given rise, certainly in North America, I know in New York, and certainly on the West Coast here, to a great deal of kind of anti-Asian racism. So the idea that it comes from foreigners, that it comes from these outsiders who don't belong here, and there's a long history of anti-Asian racism in my city as well.
To kind of piggyback on that, and maybe the coronavirus is showing the falsity of that discourse in the sense that there is no outside, right? There is no meta language. So the racist discourse assumes that there is an outside, there's an other, there's an enemy, there's inside outside distinction that Agamben talks about, right? So, and the coronavirus clearly shows that there is no outside.
Well, I mean, it's the contradictions of that racism as well. I mean, just as in the past, or indeed still today, refugees or immigrants are blamed on the one hand for stealing jobs, but also being too lazy to work. Now, and I don't mean to make light of this, but I mean now Asian Americans or Asian Canadians are attacked literally for wearing a mask, and then blamed for spreading the disease. So, these contradictions point to this kind of impossibility, this antagonism within the racist discourse itself.
Right, Zizek talked about this in the two fantasies, right? In the Plague of Fantasies, especially with anti-Semitism under Nazi Germany. Yeah, there's a question here from Chaz. What praxis would you consider to be valid in dealing with the coronavirus?
Oh, that's an easy one. Well, I think organizing and political thought and artistic sort of expression that both takes advantage of the very isolation, which is to say, now is the time to sit down and like Lenin or like Sartre, and write your 500-page analysis of the situation. We have all this sort of free time, or at least some of us do. But also using the tools, using the bad present day, as opposed to, as Brecht would say, as opposed to being nostalgic for back when we could get together in a sweaty room and all hammer out our policies together. So let's use the tools that are available to us as well.
But how do you feel about like the Zoom burnout and fatigue that we're all feeling though? Because like some people find that there's this pressure to be productive because we have more time too.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, if for my thing, I kind of have social anxiety, so I'm glad not to have to be able to go out to see people. just to have these little boxes where people are available to us. And no, don't be productive. Don't do something. Don't be productive, but think. And writing isn't productive. Writing is just this kind of outpouring of the signifiers. Right. It's never something that's there to satisfy some big other.
Yeah, and it's a time for reading too, and taking good walks. I mean, you take a lot of walks and take photos,
Yeah.
and if anyone follows you on social media. So here's another question: does the virus serve as an object that our desire circles around? When we talk about the unconscious, it is human, post-human, unconscious, right? If the COVID-19 virus can have an unconscious, then any object that invades our body and subsequently causes wide-scale symbolic turbulence can have an unconscious. Following this logic, would you consider the pest or the tuberculosis had an unconscious?
Okay, well, I guess two things. First, is does the virus serve as an object? It serves as an object, but not so much an object of desire as an object of drive. And this is a distinction that Zizek makes, where it isn't so much that it structures our fantasy, but it's our sort of back and forth relation with the coronavirus itself. I mean, the classic example right now has to do with masks. In March or April, we were told wearing masks that just makes you touch your face more. And even if you see me touching my face right now, aren't you worried about that, right? Something's sort of happening. But now we're told that we should all, sort of make these masks and that we should wear masks. And they don't make you touch your face because you end up just touching the mask itself. So, which is to say, that's not that the coronavirus itself is this thing that we want, but rather it keeps this sort of drive circling around the object and then coming back. The second part of the question, yes, of course, tuberculosis or other plagues had an unconscious, and that's why we can look to historical accountings of previous epidemics and pandemics. And I quoted from Daniel Defoe's 1722 novel about the 1665 plague in the city of London, where you could see very, very well that there was an unconscious in terms of the anxieties of the London populace about these watchmen who were standing outside their houses, people throwing themselves out windows, and this real sense of a different sort of a population that was at risk.
No, I think that's a really good way of putting it. That it functions like the death drive. Kind of, we're all kind of circling around it. I mean, even this conference being a great example of that, right? It's kind of like a black hole at the center of everyone's existence right now.
I do want to say two things very quickly, if I can, Robert, because
Sure.
I neglected at the beginning of my talk to thank you and your team
Oh,
for putting this together. And it seems very seamless from the outside, but I know from just waiting to get on today, there's a lot of people behind the scenes who are doing all the kind of technology as well as maintaining social links. And so thank you very much.
well, thank you for being
Uh,
part of it.
yeah, and also that I think this conference itself is an example of the possibilities of this kind of digital communication. I mean, I'm something of a proselytizer for thinking dialectically about the internet, as when I was talking about the Jameson notion of being both pro and against at the same time. And I think that what the AUP is doing and what this conference is doing is an example of why we should not throw the baby of the internet out with the bathwater of Google and Eric Schmidt and Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, and I think that was the vision for the conference, is really to create, solidarity amongst scholars and really activists, anyone interested, to find something to do, because a lot of us are also bored, right? But I think it's important that we find alternatives to Zoom. And I say this on Zoom to be controversial, but I think we need to find more secure alternatives. And uh, the monopoly of Zoom, I think, is problematic for many reasons. Here's another question: do you think the virus employs a potentiality for the break of neoliberal ontology, or strengthening of it?
Um, Both, please. I think. Thanks, Chaz, for that question. They're always short and sharp and pointed. Um, I think there is a possibility to break neoliberal ontology, but we have to understand what neoliberal ontology is. Is it an ontology that is devoted to this kind of desacralization of the body, by which I mean the body being sort of disavowed and being made merely something that only the poor have, because the rich have they're in outer space, or they have their hybrid vehicles, or they have their internet consciousness and so on? Or is the ontology of, or is the neoliberal ontology, is there also a way to sort of break that in the sense that if we bring our bodies back into the internet, if we bring our bodies back into these places, if we're aware that our comrades and our students and our patients and our neighbors, that they have bodies, but they also have the body of the internet, that they also have a material connection via the internet. Is not just the cloud, it's not just this ephemeral sort of thing. Its ontology is servers and cables, and you know, it's since 2012 it's used more energy than the airline industry. Certainly it is now. The airline industry is kaput, right? And so the body of the internet itself has an ontology, and we have to be aware of that.
So you talked about, of course, the king's two bodies, and as I was listening, I was thinking of sovereign power and the shift to, you know, biopower, and of course the two forms of power are overlapping anyhow. But if you can say something about that shift in power and perhaps even necropower now in relation to the two bodies of the coronavirus.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the turn to biopower, and or you know what Toscano talked about in terms of a dual biopower, which is not to give up on the fact that bodies can organize themselves. They're not just organized from on top; they can organize from below. And a necropolitics that recognizes the disposability of life, of the unemployable, under conditions of neoliberalism, under conditions of sort of like drone warfare, under conditions of the refugee crisis, under conditions of the ICE incarceration, that those disposable bodies, they have a dignity, they have a dignitas, they have a respect that we have to, that we owe them, and they're organizing themselves. And so in terms of that necropolitics, you know, that people like well, Federici or Achille Mbembe, the Cameroonian philosopher, talk about. I think it's certainly and this goes back to the notion of the coronavirus in terms of the death drive, because we don't want to fall into a kind of humanism in terms of how what we think the answer to the coronavirus should be. We don't want to sort of think that, you know, it's just about this kind of vapid sort of solidarity, or as these misreadings of Camus' La Peste, the plague, which ignore the fact that he ignores the Arabs in Oran, in Algeria, and instead take the settler doctor Bernard Roux as an ordinary human being. He's an ordinary settler doctor, and this is not to disparage doctors, of course, you know, and what they do, but when they're held up as a figure in that sort of case, as a sort of humanist sort of prototype, it ignores other sorts of possibilities that are happening and that are available.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I guess when one thing I do wonder about, though, because, you know, I'm not very optimistic about solidarity through the internet. I mean, I think it's important as a part, but perhaps I'm thinking about Fanon's call for a radical humanism or a new humanism, which is different from the kind of humanism that we're critical of from a psychoanalytic perspective. And of course, the internet will be part of that. The virtual and the actual come together, but I still want to challenge us to think beyond screen beings. And if we can think of beyond the imaginary, particularly, right? If we want a kind of an openness to the unconscious, right? So if you can think about that with me, and it's maybe something that doesn't yet exist, but it's something to at least try to imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I don't want to be too glib when I'm talking about like the body of the internet, or the internet's two bodies, or the coronavirus's two bodies. On the one hand, the coronavirus, of course, is killing hundreds of thousands of people, or at least 100,000 now are the statistics for the US alone, the highest number of deaths in the world. But we want to make sure that those deaths are not for nothing, that they can learn something. We can learn something from how this necro state of the US in particular, but the neoliberal state in particular, in general, who it abandons to these diseases, who it abandons to poverty, who it abandons and actually targets as well, of course, with drone warfare and so on, or targets with gross inequalities of poverty and healthcare. Those are not just neglect; those are actually decisions and targets that are happening. And I would agree with Fanon with the kind of humanism, or perhaps even post-humanism, or even anti-humanism, because I mean he's very critical of sort of European humanism in terms of who is you know, as Aimé Césaire talks about as well, is who is not part of that project, and of the surprise of Europeans that the techniques of colonial incarceration were then brought home via the Holocaust. So the humanism that we need is not one that you know, continues to be surprised by the depravities of the state and the depravities of capital.
Yes, thanks for that. I don't see any questions coming in, so unless you have any other thing you want to add, I just want to thank you for a wonderful keynote speech and very engaging Q&A. And of course, I copy-pasted some of the longer questions if you want to reflect on them more on Slack. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Robert.
Yeah.
Okay. Ciao, everyone.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care.
Bye.